Chapter 34 of the Pickwick Papers by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Debra Lynn. The Pickwick Papers by Charles Dickens. Chapter 34 is wholly devoted to a full and faithful report of the memorable trial of Bardell against Pickwick. "I wonder what the foreman of the jury, whoever he'll be, has got for breakfast," said Mr. Snodgrass, by way of keeping up a conversation on the eventful morning of the 14th of February. "Ah," said Perker, "I hope he's got a good one." "Why so?" inquired Mr. Pickwick. "Highly important, very important, my dear sir," replied Perker. "A good, contented, well-breakfasted juryman is a capital thing to get hold of. Discontented or hungry jurymen, my dear sir, always find for the plaintiff." "Bless my heart," said Mr. Pickwick, looking very blank. "What do they do that for?" "Why, I don't know," replied the little man coolly. "Saves time, I suppose. If it's near dinner time, the foreman takes out his watch when the jury has retired, and says, 'Dear me, gentlemen, 10 minutes to 5, I declare. I dine at 5, gentlemen.' 'So do I,' says everybody else, except two men who ought to have dined at 3, and seem more than half disposed to stand out in consequence. The foreman smiles and puts up his watch. 'Well, gentlemen, what do we say? Plaintiff or defendant, gentlemen? I rather think, so far as I am concerned, gentlemen, I say I rather think, but don't let that influence you, I rather think the plaintiff's the man.' Upon this, 2 or 3 other men are sure to say that they think so too, as of course they do, and then they get on very unanimously and comfortably. 10 minutes past 9, said the little man, looking at his watch. "Time we were off, my dear sir. Breach of promise trial court is generally full in such cases. You had better ring for a coach, my dear sir, or we shall be rather late." Mr. Pickwick immediately rang the bell, and a coach having been procured, the 4 Pickwickians and Mr. Perker ensconced themselves therein and drove to Guildhall, Sam Weller, Mr. Lowten, and the blue bag following in a cab. "Lowten," said Perker, when they reached the outer hall of the court, "put Mr. Pickwick's friends in the students' box. Mr. Pickwick himself had better sit by me. This way, my dear sir, this way." Taking Mr. Pickwick by the coat sleeve, the little man led him to the low seat just beneath the desks of the King's Counsel, which is constructed for the convenience of attorneys, who from that spot can whisper into the ear of the leading counsel in the case any instructions that may be necessary during the progress of the trial. The occupants of this seat are invisible to the great body of spectators, inasmuch as they sit on a much lower level than either the barristers or the audience, whose seats are raised above the floor. Of course they have their backs to both, and their faces towards the judge. "That's the witness box, I suppose," said Mr. Pickwick, pointing to a kind of pulpit with a brass rail on his left hand. "That's the witness box, my dear sir," replied Perker, disinterring a quantity of papers from the blue bag which Lowten had just deposited at his feet. "And that," said Mr. Pickwick, pointing to a couple of enclosed seats on his right, "that's where the jurymen sit, is it not?" "The identical place, my dear sir," replied Perker, tapping the lid of his snuff box. Mr. Pickwick stood up in a state of great agitation, and took a glance at the court. There were already a pretty large sprinkling of spectators in the gallery, and a numerous muster of gentlemen in wigs in the barristers' seats, who presented as a body all that pleasing and extensive variety of nose and whisker for which the bar of England is so justly celebrated. Such of the gentlemen as had a brief to carry, carried it in as conspicuous a manner as possible, and occasionally scratched their noses therewith, to impress the fact more strongly on the observation of the spectators. Other gentlemen, who had no briefs to show, carried under their arms goodly octavos with a red label behind, and that underdone pie crust coloured cover which is technically known as law calf. Others, who had neither briefs nor books, thrust their hands into their pockets and looked as wise as they conveniently could. Others again moved here and there with great restlessness and earnestness of manner, content to awaken thereby the admiration and astonishment of the uninitiated strangers. The whole, to the great wonderment of Mr. Pickwick, were divided into little groups, who were chatting and discussing the news of the day in the most unfeeling manner possible, just as if no trial at all were coming on. A bow from Mr. Funky as he entered and took his seat behind the row appropriated to the King's Counsel attracted Mr. Pickwick's attention, and he had scarcely returned it when Mr. Sergeant Snubbin appeared, followed by Mr. Mallard, who half hid the sergeant behind a large crimson bag which he placed on his table, and after shaking hands with Perker, withdrew. Then there entered 2 or 3 more sergeants, and among them one with a fat body and a red face, who nodded in a friendly manner to Mr. Sergeant Snubbin, and said it was a fine morning. "Who's that red-faced man who said it was a fine morning, and nodded to our counsel?" whispered Mr. Pickwick. "Mr. Sergeant Buzfuz," replied Perker. "He's opposed to us. He leads on the other side. That gentleman behind him is Mr. Skimpin, his junior." Mr. Pickwick was on the point of inquiring, with great abhorrence of the man's cold-blooded villainy, how Mr. Sergeant Buzfuz, who was counsel for the opposite party, dared to presume to tell Mr. Sergeant Snubbin, who was counsel for him, that it was a fine morning, when he was interrupted by a general rising of the barristers and a loud cry of "Silence!" from the officers of the court. Looking round, he found that this was caused by the entrance of the judge. Mr. Justice Stareleigh, who sat in the absence of the Chief Justice occasioned by indisposition, was a most particularly short man, and so fat that he seemed all face and waistcoat. He rolled in upon 2 little turned legs, and having bobbed gravely to the bar, who bobbed gravely to him, put his little legs underneath his table, and his little 3-cornered hat upon it, and when Mr. Justice Stareleigh had done this, all you could see of him was 2 queer little eyes, 1 broad pink face, and somewhere about half of a big and very comical-looking wig. The judge had no sooner taken his seat than the officer on the floor of the court called out "Silence!" in a commanding tone, upon which another officer in the gallery cried "Silence!" in an angry manner, whereupon 3 or 4 more ushers shouted "Silence!" in a voice of indignant remonstrance. This being done, a gentleman in black, who sat below the judge, proceeded to call over the names of the jury, and after a great deal of bawling it was discovered that only 10 special jurymen were present. Upon this Mr. Sergeant Buzfuz prayed a tales. The gentleman in black then proceeded to press into the special jury 2 of the common jurymen, and a greengrocer and a chemist were caught directly. "Answer to your names, gentlemen, that you may be sworn," said the gentleman in black. "Richard Upwitch." "Here," said the greengrocer. "Thomas Groffin." "Here," said the chemist. "Take the book, gentlemen. You shall well and truly try—" "I beg this court's pardon," said the chemist, who was a tall, thin, yellow-visaged man, "but I hope this court will excuse my attendance." "On what grounds, sir?" said Mr. Justice Stareleigh. "I have no assistant, my lord," said the chemist. "I can't help that, sir," replied Mr. Justice Stareleigh. "You should hire one." "I can't afford it, my lord," rejoined the chemist. "Then you ought to be able to afford it, sir," said the judge, reddening, for Mr. Justice Stareleigh's temper bordered on the irritable, and brooked not contradiction. "I know I ought to do, if I got on as well as I deserved, but I don't, my lord," answered the chemist. "Swear the gentleman," said the judge peremptorily. The officer had got no further than the "you shall well and truly try," when he was again interrupted by the chemist. "I am to be sworn, my lord, am I?" said the chemist. "Certainly, sir," replied the testy little judge. "Very well, my lord," replied the chemist in a resigned manner. "Then there'll be murder before this trial's over, that's all. Swear me if you please, sir." And sworn the chemist was before the judge could find words to utter. "I merely wanted to observe, my lord," said the chemist, taking his seat with great deliberation, "that I've left nobody but an errand boy in my shop. He is a very nice boy, my lord, but he is not acquainted with drugs, and I know that the prevailing impression on his mind is that Epsom salts means oxalic acid, and syrup of senna laudanum. That's all, my lord." With this the tall chemist composed himself into a comfortable attitude, and assuming a pleasant expression of countenance, appeared to have prepared himself for the worst. Mr. Pickwick was regarding the chemist with feelings of the deepest horror, when a slight sensation was perceptible in the body of the court, and immediately afterwards Mrs. Bardell, supported by Mrs. Cluppins, was led in and placed in a drooping state at the other end of the seat on which Mr. Pickwick sat. An extra-sized umbrella was then handed in by Mr. Dodson, and a pair of pattens by Mr. Fogg, each of whom had prepared a most sympathizing and melancholy face for the occasion. Mrs. Sanders then appeared, leading in Master Bardell. At sight of her child, Mrs. Bardell started. Suddenly recollecting herself, she kissed him in a frantic manner. Then, relapsing into a state of hysterical imbecility, the good lady requested to be informed where she was. In reply to this, Mrs. Cluppins and Mrs. Saunders turned their heads away and wept, while Messrs. Dodson and Fogg entreated the plaintiff to compose herself. Sergeant Buzfuz rubbed his eyes very hard with a large white handkerchief, and gave an appealing look towards the jury, while the judge was visibly affected, and several of the beholders tried to cough down their emotion. "Very good notion that, indeed," whispered Perker to Mr. Pickwick. "Capital fellows, those Dodson and Fogg. Excellent ideas of effect, my dear sir, excellent." As Perker spoke, Mrs. Bardell began to recover by slow degrees, while Mrs. Cluppins, after a careful survey of Master Bardell's buttons and the buttonholes to which they severally belonged, placed him on the floor of the court in front of his mother, a commanding position in which he could not fail to awaken the full commiseration and sympathy of both judge and jury. This was not done without considerable opposition and many tears on the part of the young gentleman himself, who had certain inward misgivings that the placing him within the full glare of the judge's eye was only a formal prelude to his being immediately ordered away for instant execution, or for transportation beyond the seas, during the whole term of his natural life at the very least. "Bardell and Pickwick," cried the gentleman in black, calling on the case which stood first on the list. "I am for the plaintiff, my lord," said Mr. Sergeant Buzfuz. "Who is with you, brother Buzfuz?" said the judge. Mr. Skimpin bowed to intimate that he was. "I appear for the defendant, my lord," said Mr. Sergeant Snubbin. "Anybody with you, brother Snubbin?" inquired the court. "Mr. Funky, my lord," replied Sergeant Snubbin. "Sergeant Buzfuz and Mr. Skimpin for the plaintiff," said the judge, writing down the names in his note book and reading as he wrote. "For the defendant, Sergeant Snubbin and Mr. Monkey." "Beg your lordship's pardon. Funky." "Oh, very good," said the judge. "I never had the pleasure of hearing the gentleman's name before." Here Mr. Funky bowed and smiled, and the judge bowed and smiled too, and then Mr. Funky, blushing into the very whites of his eyes, tried to look as if he didn't know that everybody was gazing at him, a thing which no man ever succeeded in doing yet, or in all reasonable probability ever will. "Go on," said the judge. The ushers again called silence, and Mr. Skimpin proceeded to open the case, and the case appeared to have very little inside it when he had opened it, for he kept such particulars as he knew completely to himself, and sat down after a lapse of 3 minutes, leaving the jury in precisely the same advanced state of wisdom as they were in before. Sergeant Buzfuz then rose with all the majesty and dignity which the grave nature of the proceedings demanded, and having whispered to Dodson and conferred briefly with Fogg, pulled his gown over his shoulders, settled his wig, and addressed the jury. Sergeant Buzfuz began by saying that never, in the whole course of his professional experience, never, from the very first moment of his applying himself to the study and practice of the law, had he approached a case with feelings of such deep emotion, or with such a heavy sense of the responsibility imposed upon him. A responsibility, he would say, which he could never have supported were he not buoyed up and sustained by a conviction so strong that it amounted to positive certainty that the cause of truth and justice, or in other words, the cause of his much injured and most oppressed client, must prevail with the high-minded and intelligent dozen of men whom he now saw in that box before him. Counsel usually begin in this way because it puts the jury on the very best terms with themselves, and makes them think what sharp fellows they must be. A visible effect was produced immediately, several jurymen beginning to take voluminous notes with the utmost eagerness. "You have heard from my learned friend, gentlemen," continued Sergeant Buzfuz, well knowing that from the learned friend alluded to, the gentlemen of the jury had heard just nothing at all. "You have heard from my learned friend, gentlemen, that this is an action for a breach of promise of marriage, in which the damages are laid at £1,500. But you have not heard from my learned friend, inasmuch as it did not come within my learned friend's province to tell you, what are the facts and circumstances of the case. Those facts and circumstances, gentlemen, you shall hear detailed by me, and proved by the unimpeachable female whom I will place in that box before you." Here Mr. Serjeant Buzfuz, with a tremendous emphasis on the word box, smote his table with a mighty sound, and glanced at Dodson and Fogg, who nodded admiration of the serjeant, and indignant defiance of the defendant. "The plaintiff, gentlemen," continued Serjeant Buzfuz, in a soft and melancholy voice, "the plaintiff is a widow. Yes, gentlemen, a widow. The late Mr. Bardell, after enjoying for many years the esteem and confidence of his sovereign, as one of the guardians of his royal revenues, glided almost imperceptibly from the world to seek elsewhere for that repose and peace which a custom house can never afford." At this pathetic description of the decease of Mr. Bardell, who had been knocked on the head with a quart pot in a public house cellar, the learned serjeant's voice faltered, and he proceeded with emotion. Some time before his death he had stamped his likeness upon a little boy. With this little boy, the only pledge of her departed exciseman, Mrs. Bardell shrank from the world and courted the retirement and tranquillity of Goswell Street, and here she placed in her front parlour window a written placard bearing this inscription: "Apartments furnished for a single gentleman. Inquire within." Here Serjeant Buzfuz paused, while several gentlemen of the jury took a note of the document. "There is no date to that, is there?" inquired a juror. "There is no date, gentlemen," replied Serjeant Buzfuz, "but I am instructed to say that it was put in the plaintiff's parlour window just this time 3 years. I entreat the attention of the jury to the wording of this document: apartments furnished for a single gentleman. Mrs. Bardell's opinions of the opposite sex, gentlemen, were derived from a long contemplation of the inestimable qualities of her lost husband. She had no fear, she had no distrust, she had no suspicion. All was confidence and reliance. Mr. Bardell," said the widow, "Mr. Bardell was a man of honour. Mr. Bardell was a man of his word. Mr. Bardell was no deceiver. Mr. Bardell was once a single gentleman himself. To single gentlemen I look for protection, for assistance, for comfort, and for consolation. In single gentlemen I shall perpetually see something to remind me of what Mr. Bardell was when he first won my young and untried affections. To a single gentleman, then, shall my lodgings be let." Actuated by this beautiful and touching impulse, among the best impulses of our imperfect nature, gentlemen, the lonely and desolate widow dried her tears, furnished her first floor, caught her innocent boy to her maternal bosom, and put the bill up in her parlour window. Did it remain there long? No. The serpent was on the watch. The train was laid. The mine was preparing. The sapper and miner was at work. Before the bill had been in the parlour window 3 days, 3 days, gentlemen, a being, erect upon 2 legs, and bearing all the outward semblance of a man, and not of a monster, knocked at the door of Mrs. Bardell's house. He inquired within. He took the lodgings, and on the very next day he entered into possession of them. This man was Pickwick. Pickwick, the defendant. Serjeant Buzfuz, who had proceeded with such volubility that his face was perfectly crimson, here paused for breath. The silence awoke Mr. Justice Stareleigh, who immediately wrote down something with a pen without any ink in it, and looked unusually profound, to impress the jury with the belief that he always thought most deeply with his eyes shut. Serjeant Buzfuz proceeded: "Of this man Pickwick I will say little. The subject presents but few attractions, and I, gentlemen, am not the man, nor are you, gentlemen, the men, to delight in the contemplation of revolting heartlessness and of systematic villainy." Here Mr. Pickwick, who had been writhing in silence for some time, gave a violent start, as if some vague idea of assaulting Serjeant Buzfuz, in the august presence of justice and law, suggested itself to his mind. An admonitory gesture from Perker restrained him, and he listened to the learned gentleman's continuation with a look of indignation, which contrasted forcibly with the admiring faces of Mrs. Cluppins and Mrs. Sanders. "I say systematic villainy, gentlemen," said Serjeant Buzfuz, looking through Mr. Pickwick and talking at him. "And when I say systematic villainy, let me tell the defendant Pickwick, if he be in court, as I am informed he is, that it would have been more decent in him, more becoming, in better judgment and in better taste, if he had stopped away. Let me tell him, gentlemen, that any gestures of dissent or disapprobation in which he may indulge in this court will not go down with you, that you will know how to value and how to appreciate them. And let me tell him further, as my lord will tell you, gentlemen, that a counsel, in the discharge of his duty to his client, is neither to be intimidated, nor bullied, nor put down, and that any attempt to do either the one or the other, or the first or the last, will recoil on the head of the attempter, be he plaintiff or be he defendant, be his name Pickwick or Noakes or Stokes or Styles or Brown or Thompson." This little divergence from the subject in hand had, of course, the intended effect of turning all eyes to Mr. Pickwick. Sergeant Buzfuz, having partially recovered from the state of moral elevation into which he had lashed himself, resumed. "I shall show you, gentlemen, that for 2 years Pickwick continued to reside constantly and without interruption or intermission at Mrs. Bardell's house. I shall show you that Mrs. Bardell, during the whole of that time, waited on him, attended to his comforts, cooked his meals, looked out his linen for the washerwoman when it went abroad, darned, aired, and prepared it for wear when it came home, and in short enjoyed his fullest trust and confidence. I shall show you that on many occasions he gave halfpence, and on some occasions even sixpences, to her little boy, and I shall prove to you, by a witness whose testimony it will be impossible for my learned friend to weaken or controvert, that on one occasion he patted the boy on the head, and after inquiring whether he had won any alley-tours or comedies lately, both of which I understand to be a particular species of marbles much prized by the youth of this town, made use of this remarkable expression: 'How should you like to have another father?' I shall prove to you, gentlemen, that about a year ago Pickwick suddenly began to absent himself from home during long intervals, as if with the intention of gradually breaking off from my client. But I shall show you also that his resolution was not at that time sufficiently strong, or that his better feelings conquered, if better feelings he has, or that the charms and accomplishments of my client prevailed against his unmanly intentions, by proving to you that on one occasion, when he returned from the country, he distinctly and in terms offered her marriage, previously, however, taking special care that there would be no witness to their solemn contract. And I am in a situation to prove to you, on the testimony of 3 of his own friends, most unwilling witnesses, gentlemen, most unwilling witnesses, that on that morning he was discovered by them holding the plaintiff in his arms, and soothing her agitation by his caresses and endearments." A visible impression was produced upon the auditors by this part of the learned sergeant's address. Drawing forth 2 very small scraps of paper, he proceeded: "And now, gentlemen, but one word more. 2 letters have passed between these parties, letters which are admitted to be in the handwriting of the defendant, and which speak volumes indeed. The letters, too, bespeak the character of the man. They are not open, fervent, eloquent epistles, breathing nothing but the language of affectionate attachment. They are covert, sly, underhanded communications, but fortunately far more conclusive than if couched in the most glowing language and the most poetic imagery, letters that must be viewed with a cautious and suspicious eye, letters that were evidently intended at the time by Pickwick to mislead and delude any third parties into whose hands they might fall. Let me read the first. Garraway's, 12 o'clock. Dear Mrs. B., chops and tomato sauce. Yours, Pickwick. Gentlemen, what does this mean? Chops and tomato sauce. Yours, Pickwick. Chops! Gracious heavens! And tomato sauce! Gentlemen, is the happiness of a sensitive and confiding female to be trifled away by such shallow artifices as these? The next has no date whatever, which is in itself suspicious. Dear Mrs. B., I shall not be at home till to-morrow. Slow coach. And then follows this very remarkable expression: Don't trouble yourself about the warming pan.
The warming pan. Why, gentlemen, who does trouble himself about a warming pan? When was the peace of mind of man or woman broken or disturbed by a warming pan, which is in itself a harmless, a useful, and I will add, gentlemen, a comforting article of domestic furniture? Why is Mrs. Bardell so earnestly entreated not to agitate herself about this warming pan, unless, as is no doubt the case, it is a mere cover for hidden fire, a mere substitute for some endearing word or promise, agreeably to a preconcerted system of correspondence, artfully contrived by Pickwick with a view to his contemplated desertion, and which I am not in a condition to explain? And what does this allusion to the slow coach mean? For aught I know, it may be a reference to Pickwick himself, who has most unquestionably been a criminally slow coach during the whole of this transaction, but whose speed will now be very unexpectedly accelerated, and whose wheels, gentlemen, as he will find to his cost, will very soon be greased by you." Mr. Serjeant Buzfuz paused in this place to see whether the jury smiled at his joke, but as nobody took it but the greengrocer, whose sensitiveness on the subject was very probably occasioned by his having subjected a chaise cart to the process in question on that identical morning, the learned serjeant considered it advisable to undergo a slight relapse into the dismals before he concluded. "But enough of this, gentlemen," said Mr. Serjeant Buzfuz. "It is difficult to smile with an aching heart. It is ill jesting when our deepest sympathies are awakened. My client's hopes and prospects are ruined, and it is no figure of speech to say that her occupation is gone indeed. The bill is down, but there is no tenant. Eligible single gentlemen pass and repass, but there is no invitation for to inquire within or without. All is gloom and silence in the house. Even the voice of the child is hushed. His infant sports are disregarded when his mother weeps. His alley tours and his comedies are alike neglected. He forgets the long familiar cry of knuckle down, and at tip cheese or odd and even his hand is out. But Pickwick, gentlemen, Pickwick, the ruthless destroyer of this domestic oasis in the desert of Goswell Street, Pickwick, who has choked up the well and thrown ashes on the sward, Pickwick, who comes before you to-day with his heartless tomato sauce and warming pans, Pickwick still rears his head with unblushing effrontery, and gazes without a sigh on the ruin he has made. Damages, gentlemen, heavy damages, as the only punishment with which you can visit him, the only recompense you can award to my client, and for those damages she now appeals to an enlightened, a high-minded, a right-feeling, a conscientious, a dispassionate, a sympathizing, a contemplative jury of her civilized countrymen." With this beautiful peroration Mr. Serjeant Buzfuz sat down, and Mr. Justice Stareleigh woke up. "Call Elizabeth Cluppins," said Serjeant Buzfuz, rising a minute afterwards with renewed vigour. The nearest usher called for Elizabeth Tuppins. Another one at a little distance off demanded Elizabeth Jupkins, and a third rushed in a breathless state into King Street and screamed for Elizabeth Muffins till he was hoarse. Meanwhile Mrs. Cluppins, with the combined assistance of Mrs. Bardell, Mrs. Sanders, Mr. Dodson, and Mr. Fogg, was hoisted into the witness box; and when she was safely perched on the top step, Mrs. Bardell stood on the bottom one, with the pocket handkerchief and pattens in one hand, and a glass bottle that might hold about a quarter of a pint of smelling salts in the other, ready for any emergency. Mrs. Saunders, whose eyes were intently fixed on the judge's face, planted herself close by with a large umbrella, keeping her right thumb pressed on the spring with an earnest countenance, as if she were fully prepared to put it up at a moment's notice. "Mrs. Cluppins," said Serjeant Buzfuz, "pray compose yourself, ma'am." Of course, directly Mrs. Cluppins was desired to compose herself, she sobbed with increased vehemence, and gave divers alarming manifestations of an approaching fainting fit, or, as she afterwards said, of her feelings being too many for her. "Do you recollect, Mrs. Cluppins," said Serjeant Buzfuz, after a few unimportant questions, "do you recollect being in Mrs. Bardell's back one pair of stairs on one particular morning in July last, when she was dusting Pickwick's apartment?" "Yes, my lord and jury, I do," replied Mrs. Cluppins. "Mr. Pickwick's sitting room was the first floor front, I believe?" "Yes, it were, sir," replied Mrs. Cluppins. "What were you doing in the back room, ma'am?" inquired the little judge. "My lord and jury," said Mrs. Cluppins with interesting agitation, "I will not deceive you." "You had better not, ma'am," said the little judge. "I was there," resumed Mrs. Cluppins, "unbeknown to Mrs. Bardell. I had been out with a little basket, gentlemen, to buy 3 pound of red kidney pertaties, which was 3 pound 2 halfpenny, when I see Mrs. Bardell's street door on the jar." "On the what?" exclaimed the little judge. "Partly open, my lord," said Sergeant Snubbin. "She said on the jar," said the little judge with a cunning look. "It's all the same, my lord," said Sergeant Snubbin. The little judge looked doubtful, and said he'd make a note of it. Mrs. Cluppins then resumed. "I walked in, gentlemen, just to say good mornin', and went in a promiscuous manner upstairs and into the back room. Gentlemen, there was the sound of voices in the front room, and—" "And you listened, I believe, Mrs. Cluppins?" said Sergeant Buzfuz. "Beggin' your pardon, sir," replied Mrs. Cluppins in a majestic manner, "I would scorn the haction. The voices was very loud, sir, and forced themselves upon my ear." "Well, Mrs. Cluppins, you were not listening, but you heard the voices? Was one of those voices Pickwick's?" "Yes, it were, sir." And Mrs. Cluppins, after distinctly stating that Mr. Pickwick addressed himself to Mrs. Bardell, repeated by slow degrees, and by dint of many questions, the conversation with which our readers are already acquainted. The jury looked suspicious, and Mr. Sergeant Buzfuz smiled as he sat down. They looked positively awful when Sergeant Snubbin intimated that he should not cross-examine the witness, for Mr. Pickwick wished it to be distinctly stated that it was due to her to say that her account was in substance correct. Mrs. Cluppins, having once broken the ice, thought it a favourable opportunity for entering into a short dissertation on her own domestic affairs, so she straightway proceeded to inform the court that she was the mother of 8 children at that present speaking, and that she entertained confident expectations of presenting Mr. Cluppins with the 9th somewhere about that day 6 months. At this interesting point the little judge interposed most irascibly, and the effect of the interposition was that both the worthy lady and Mrs. Saunders were politely taken out of court under the escort of Mr. Jackson without further parley. "Nathaniel Winkle," said Mr. Skimpin. "Here," replied a feeble voice. Mr. Winkle entered the witness box, and having been duly sworn, bowed to the judge with considerable deference. "Don't look at me, sir," said the judge sharply, in acknowledgment of the salute. "Look at the jury." Mr. Winkle obeyed the mandate, and looked at the place where he thought it most probable the jury might be, for seeing anything in his then state of intellectual complication was wholly out of the question. Mr. Winkle was then examined by Mr. Skimpin, who, being a promising young man of 2 or 3 and 40, was of course anxious to confuse a witness who was notoriously predisposed in favour of the other side as much as he could. "Now, sir," said Mr. Skimpin, "have the goodness to let his lordship know what your name is, will you?" And Mr. Skimpin inclined his head on one side to listen with great sharpness to the answer, and glanced at the jury meanwhile as if to imply that he rather expected Mr. Winkle's natural taste for perjury would induce him to give some name which did not belong to him. "Winkle," replied the witness. "What's your Christian name, sir?" angrily inquired the little judge. "Nathaniel, sir." "Daniel? Any other name?" "Nathaniel, sir, my lord, I mean." "Nathaniel Daniel, or Daniel Nathaniel?" "No, my lord, only Nathaniel, not Daniel at all." "What did you tell me it was Daniel for, then, sir?" inquired the judge. "I didn't, my lord," replied Mr. Winkle. "You did, sir," replied the judge with a severe frown. "How could I have got Daniel on my notes unless you told me so, sir?" This argument was, of course, unanswerable. "Mr. Winkle has rather a short memory, my lord," interposed Mr. Skimpin, with another glance at the jury. "We shall find means to refresh it before we have quite done with him, I dare say." "You had better be careful, sir," said the little judge, with a sinister look at the witness. Poor Mr. Winkle bowed, and endeavoured to feign an easiness of manner which, in his then state of confusion, gave him rather the air of a disconcerted pickpocket. "Now, Mr. Winkle," said Mr. Skimpin, "attend to me, if you please, sir, and let me recommend you, for your own sake, to bear in mind his lordship's injunctions to be careful. I believe you are a particular friend of Mr. Pickwick, the defendant, are you not?" "I have known Mr. Pickwick now, as well as I recollect at this moment, nearly—" "Pray, Mr. Winkle, do not evade the question. Are you or are you not a particular friend of the defendant's?" "I was just about to say that—" "Will you or will you not answer my question, sir?" "If you don't answer the question, you'll be committed, sir," interposed the little judge, looking over his note book. "Come, sir," said Mr. Skimpin, "yes or no, if you please." "Yes, I am," replied Mr. Winkle. "Yes, you are. And why couldn't you say that at once, sir? Perhaps you know the plaintiff too, eh, Mr. Winkle?" "I don't know her. I've seen her." "Oh, you don't know her, but you've seen her. Now have the goodness to tell the gentlemen of the jury what you mean by that, Mr. Winkle." "I mean that I am not intimate with her, but I have seen her when I went to call on Mr. Pickwick in Goswell Street." "How often have you seen her, sir?" "How often?" "Yes, Mr. Winkle, how often? I'll repeat the question for you a dozen times, if you require it, sir." And the learned gentleman, with a firm and steady frown, placed his hands on his hips and smiled suspiciously to the jury. On this question there arose the edifying browbeating customary on such points. First of all, Mr. Winkle said it was quite impossible for him to say how many times he had seen Mrs. Bardell. Then he was asked if he had seen her 20 times, to which he replied, "Certainly, more than that." Then he was asked whether he hadn't seen her 100 times, whether he couldn't swear that he had seen her more than 50 times, whether he didn't know that he had seen her at least 75 times, and so forth, the satisfactory conclusion which was arrived at last being that he had better take care of himself and mind what he was about. The witness having been by these means reduced to the requisite ebb of nervous perplexity, the examination was continued as follows. "Pray, Mr. Winkle, do you remember calling on the defendant Pickwick at these apartments in the plaintiff's house in Goswell Street on one particular morning in the month of July last?" "Yes, I do." "Were you accompanied on that occasion by a friend of the name of Tupman and another by the name of Snodgrass?" "Yes, I was." "Are they here?" "Yes, they are," replied Mr. Winkle, looking very earnestly towards the spot where his friends were stationed. "Pray attend to me, Mr. Winkle, and never mind your friends," said Mr. Skimpin, with another expressive look at the jury. "They must tell their stories without any previous consultation with you, if none has yet taken place." Another look at the jury. "Now, sir, tell the gentlemen of the jury what you saw on entering the defendant's room on this particular morning. Come, out with it, sir. We must have it sooner or later." "The defendant, Mr. Pickwick, was holding the plaintiff in his arms with his hands clasping her waist," replied Mr. Winkle with natural hesitation, "and the plaintiff appeared to have fainted away." "Did you hear the defendant say anything?" "I heard him call Mrs. Bardell a good creature, and I heard him ask her to compose herself, for what a situation it was if anybody should come, or words to that effect. Now, Mr. Winkle, I have only one more question to ask you, and I beg you to bear in mind his lordship's caution. Will you undertake to swear that Pickwick, the defendant, did not say on the occasion in question, 'My dear Mrs. Bardell, you're a good creature. Compose yourself to this situation, for to this situation you must come,' or words to that effect?" I didn't understand him so, certainly," said Mr. Winkle, astounded on this ingenious dovetailing of the few words he had heard. "I was on the staircase, and couldn't hear distinctly. The impression on my mind is—" "The gentlemen of the jury want none of the impressions on your mind, Mr. Winkle, which I fear would be of little service to honest, straightforward men," interposed Mr. Skimpin. "You were on the staircase, and didn't distinctly hear. But you will not swear that Pickwick did not make use of the expressions I have quoted. Do I understand that?" "No, I will not," replied Mr. Winkle, and down sat Mr. Skimpin with a triumphant countenance. Mr. Pickwick's case had not gone off in so particularly happy a manner up to this point that it could very well afford to have any additional suspicion cast upon it. But as it could afford to be placed in a rather better light if possible, Mr. Funky rose for the purpose of getting something important out of Mr. Winkle in cross-examination. Whether he did get anything important out of him will immediately appear. "I believe, Mr. Winkle," said Mr. Funky, "that Mr. Pickwick is not a young man." "Oh, no," replied Mr. Winkle, "old enough to be my father." "You have told my learned friend that you have known Mr. Pickwick a long time. Had you ever any reason to suppose or believe that he was about to be married?" "Oh, no, certainly not," replied Mr. Winkle, with so much eagerness that Mr. Funky ought to have got him out of the box with all possible dispatch. Lawyers hold that there are two kinds of particularly bad witnesses, a reluctant witness and a too willing witness. It was Mr. Winkle's fate to figure in both characters. "I will even go further than this, Mr. Winkle," continued Mr. Funky, in a most smooth and complacent manner. "Did you ever see anything in Mr. Pickwick's manner and conduct towards the opposite sex to induce you to believe that he ever contemplated matrimony of late years in any case?" "Oh, no, certainly not," replied Mr. Winkle. "Has his behaviour, when females have been in the case, always been that of a man who, having attained a pretty advanced period of life, content with his own occupations and amusements, treats them only as a father might his daughters?" "Not the least doubt of it," replied Mr. Winkle in the fullness of his heart. "That is, yes. Oh, yes, certainly." "You have never known anything in his behaviour towards Mrs. Bardell, or any other female, in the least degree suspicious?" said Mr. Funky, preparing to sit down, for Sergeant Snubbin was winking at him. "No," replied Mr. Winkle, "except on one trifling occasion, which I have no doubt might be easily explained." Now, if the unfortunate Mr. Funky had sat down when Sergeant Snubbin had winked at him, or if Sergeant Buzfuz had stopped this irregular cross-examination at the outset, which he knew better than to do, observing Mr. Winkle's anxiety, and well knowing it would in all probability lead to something serviceable to him, this unfortunate admission would not have been elicited. The moment the words fell from Mr. Winkle's lips, Mr. Funky sat down, and Sergeant Snubbin rather hastily told him he might leave the box, which Mr. Winkle prepared to do with great readiness, when Sergeant Buzfuz stopped him. "Stay, Mr. Winkle, stay," said Sergeant Buzfuz. "Will your lordship have the goodness to ask him what this one instance of suspicious behaviour towards females on the part of this gentleman, who is old enough to be his father, was?" "You hear what the learned counsel says, sir," observed the judge, turning to the miserable and agonized Mr. Winkle. "Describe the occasion to which you refer." "My lord," said Mr. Winkle, trembling with anxiety, I'd rather not." "Perhaps so," said the little judge, "but you must." Amid the profound silence of the whole court, Mr. Winkle faltered out that the trifling circumstance of suspicion was Mr. Pickwick's being found in a lady's sleeping apartment at midnight, which had terminated, he believed, in the breaking off of the projected marriage of the lady in question, and had led, he knew, to the whole party being forcibly carried before George Nupkins, Esquire, magistrate and justice of the peace for the borough of Ipswich. "You may leave the box, sir," said Sergeant Snubbin. Mr. Winkle did leave the box, and rushed with delirious haste to the George and Vulture, where he was discovered some hours after by the waiter, groaning in a hollow and dismal manner, with his head buried beneath the sofa cushions. Tracy Tupman and Augustus Snodgrass were severally called into the box. Both corroborated the testimony of their unhappy friend, and each was driven to the verge of desperation by excessive badgering. Susanna Saunders was then called and examined by Sergeant Buzfuz, and cross-examined by Sergeant Snubbin. Had always said and believed that Pickwick would marry Mrs. Bardell. Knew that Mrs. Bardell's being engaged to Pickwick was the current topic of conversation in the neighbourhood, after the fainting in July. Had been told it herself by Mrs. Mudberry, which kept a mangle, and Mrs. Bunkin, which clear starched, but did not see either Mrs. Mudberry or Mrs. Bunkin in court. Had heard Pickwick ask the little boy how he should like to have another father. did not know that Mrs. Bardell was at that time keeping company with a baker, but did know that the baker was then a single man and is now married. Couldn't swear that Mrs. Bardell was not very fond of the baker, but should think that the baker was not very fond of Mrs. Bardell, or he wouldn't have married somebody else. Thought Mrs. Bardell fainted away on the morning in July because Pickwick asked her to name the day. Knew that she, witness, fainted away stone dead when Mr. Saunders asked her to name the day, and believed that everybody as called herself a lady would do the same under similar circumstances. Heard Pickwick ask the boy the question about the marbles, but upon her oath did not know the difference between an alley tour and a comedy. By the court. During the period of her keeping company with Mr. Saunders had received love letters like other ladies. In the course of their correspondence Mr. Saunders had often called her a duck, but never chops, nor yet tomato sauce. He was particularly fond of ducks. Perhaps if he had been as fond of chops and tomato sauce he might have called her that as a term of affection. Sergeant Buzfuz now rose with more importance than he had yet exhibited, if that were possible, and vociferated, "Call Samuel Weller." It was quite unnecessary to call Samuel Weller, for Samuel Weller stepped briskly into the box the instant his name was pronounced, and placing his hat on the floor and his arms on the rail, took a bird's eye view of the bar and a comprehensive survey of the bench, with a remarkably cheerful and lively aspect. "What's your name, sir?" inquired the judge. "Sam Weller, my lord," replied that gentleman. "Do you spell it with a V or a W?" inquired the judge. "That depends upon the taste and fancy of the speller, my lord," replied Sam. "I never had occasion to spell it more than once or twice in my life, but I spells it with a V." Here a voice in the gallery exclaimed aloud, "Quite right too, Samivel, quite right. Put it down a we, my lord, put it down a we." "Who is that who dares address the court?" said the little judge, looking up. "Usher?" "Yes, my lord." "Bring that person here instantly." "Yes, my lord." But as the usher didn't find the person, he didn't bring him, and after a great commotion all the people who had got up to look for the culprit sat down again. The little judge turned to the witness as soon as his indignation would allow him to speak, and said, "Do you know who that was, sir?" "I rather suspect it was my father, my lord," replied Sam. "Do you see him here now?" said the judge. "No, I don't, my lord," replied Sam, staring right up into the lantern at the roof of the court. "If you could have pointed him out I would have committed him instantly," said the judge. Sam bowed his acknowledgments, and turned, with unimpaired cheerfulness of countenance, towards Sergeant Buzfuz. "Now, Mr. Weller," said Sergeant Buzfuz. "Now, sir," replied Sam. "I believe you are in the service of Mr. Pickwick, the defendant in this case. Speak up, if you please, Mr. Weller." "I mean to speak up, sir," replied Sam. "I am in the service of that 'ere gentleman, and a wery good service it is." "Little to do and plenty to get, I suppose," said Sergeant Buzfuz with jocularity. "Oh, quite enough to get, sir, as the soldier said when they ordered him 350 lashes," replied Sam. "You must not tell us what the soldier or any other man said, sir," interposed the judge. "It's not evidence." "Wery good, my lord," replied Sam. "Do you recollect anything particular happening on the morning when you were first engaged by the defendant, Mr. Weller?" said Sergeant Buzfuz. "Yes, I do, sir," replied Sam. "Have the goodness to tell the jury what it was." "I had a reg'lar new fit out o' clothes that mornin', gentlemen of the jury," said Sam, "and that was a wery partickler and uncommon circumstance with me in those days." Hereupon there was a general laugh, and the little judge, looking with an angry countenance over his desk, said, "You had better be careful, sir." "So Mr. Pickwick said at the time, my lord," replied Sam, "and I was wery careful of that 'ere suit o' clothes. Wery careful indeed, my lord." The judge looked sternly at Sam for full 2 minutes, but Sam's features were so perfectly calm and serene that the judge said nothing, and motioned Sergeant Buzfuz to proceed. "Do you mean to tell me, Mr. Weller," said Sergeant Buzfuz, folding his arms emphatically and turning half round to the jury, as if in mute assurance that he would bother the witness yet, "do you mean to tell me, Mr. Weller, that you saw nothing of this fainting on the part of the plaintiff in the arms of the defendant, which you have heard described by the witnesses?" "Certainly not," replied Sam. "I was in the passage till they called me up, and then the old lady was not there." "Now attend, Mr. Weller," said Sergeant Buzfuz, dipping a large pen into the inkstand before him for the purpose of frightening Sam with a show of taking down his answer. "You were in the passage, and yet saw nothing of what was going forward. Have you a pair of eyes, Mr. Weller?" "Yes, I have a pair of eyes," replied Sam, "and that's just it. If they was a pair of patent double million magnifying gas microscopes of hextra power, p'raps I might be able to see through a flight of stairs and a deal door, but being only eyes, you see, my wision's limited." At this answer, which was delivered without the slightest appearance of irritation, and with the most complete simplicity and equanimity of manner, the spectators tittered, the little judge smiled, and Sergeant Buzfuz looked particularly foolish. After a short consultation with Dodson and Fogg, the learned sergeant again turned towards Sam, and said, with a painful effort to conceal his vexation, "Now, Mr. Weller, I'll ask you a question on another point, if you please." "If you please, sir," rejoined Sam, with the utmost good humour. "Do you remember going up to Mrs. Bardell's house one night in November last?" "Oh, yes, werry well." "Oh, you do remember that, Mr. Weller," said Sergeant Buzfuz, recovering his spirits. "I thought we should get at something at last." "I rayther thought that too, sir," replied Sam, and at this the spectators tittered again. "Well, I suppose you went up to have a little talk about this trial, eh, Mr. Weller?" said Sergeant Buzfuz, looking knowingly at the jury. "I went up to pay the rent, but we did get a talking about the trial," replied Sam. "Oh, you did get a talking about the trial," said Sergeant Buzfuz, brightening up with the anticipation of some important discovery. "Now, what passed about the trial? Will you have the goodness to tell us, Mr. Weller?" "Vith all the pleasure in life, sir," replied Sam. "Arter a few unimportant obserwations from the two wirtuous females as has been examined here to day, the ladies gets into a very great state of admiration at the honourable conduct of Mr. Dodson and Fogg, them two gentlemen as is settin' near you now." This, of course, drew general attention to Dodson and Fogg, who looked as virtuous as possible. "The attorneys for the plaintiff," said Mr. Sergeant Buzfuz. "Well, they spoke in high praise of the honourable conduct of Messrs. Dodson and Fogg, the attorneys for the plaintiff, did they?" "Yes," said Sam. "They said what a werry generous thing it was of them to have taken up the case on spec, and to charge nothing at all for costs unless they got 'em out of Mr. Pickwick." At this very unexpected reply the spectators tittered again, and Dodson and Fogg, turning very red, leaned over to Sergeant Buzfuz and in a hurried manner whispered something in his ear. "You are quite right," said Sergeant Buzfuz aloud, with affected composure. "It's perfectly useless, my lord, attempting to get at any evidence through the impenetrable stupidity of this witness. I will not trouble the court by asking him any more questions. Stand down, sir." "Would any other gentleman like to ask me anything?" inquired Sam, taking up his hat and looking round most deliberately. "Not I, Mr. Weller, thank you," said Sergeant Snubbin, laughing. "You may go down, sir," said Sergeant Buzfuz, waving his hand impatiently. Sam went down accordingly, after doing Messrs. Dodson and Fogg's case as much harm as he conveniently could, and saying just as little respecting Mr. Pickwick as might be, which was precisely the object he had had in view all along. "I have no objection to admit, my lord," said Sergeant Snubbin, "if it will save the examination of another witness, that Mr. Pickwick has retired from business, and is a gentleman of considerable independent property." "Very well," said Sergeant Buzfuz, putting in the two letters to be read. "Then that's my case, my lord." Sergeant Snubbin then addressed the jury on behalf of the defendant, and a very long and a very emphatic address he delivered, in which he bestowed the highest possible eulogiums on the conduct and character of Mr. Pickwick. But inasmuch as our readers are far better able to form a correct estimate of that gentleman's merits and deserts than Sergeant Snubbin could possibly be, we do not feel called upon to enter at any length into the learned gentleman's observations. He attempted to show that the letters which had been exhibited merely related to Mr. Pickwick's dinner, or to the preparations for receiving him in his apartments on his return from some country excursion. It is sufficient to add, in general terms, that he did the best he could for Mr. Pickwick, and the best, as everybody knows, on the infallible authority of the old adage, could do no more. Mr. Justice Stareleigh summed up in the old established and most approved form. He read as much of his notes to the jury as he could decipher on so short a notice, and made running comments on the evidence as he went along. If Mrs. Bardell were right, it was perfectly clear that Mr. Pickwick was wrong, and if they thought the evidence of Mrs. Cluppins worthy of credence, they would believe it, and if they didn't, why, they wouldn't. If they were satisfied that a breach of promise of marriage had been committed, they would find for the plaintiff with such damages as they thought proper, and if, on the other hand, it appeared to them that no promise of marriage had ever been given, they would find for the defendant with no damages at all. The jury then retired to their private room to talk the matter over, and the judge retired to his private room to refresh himself with a mutton chop and a glass of sherry. An anxious quarter of an hour elapsed. The jury came back. The judge was fetched in. Mr. Pickwick put on his spectacles and gazed at the foreman with an agitated countenance and a quickly beating heart. "Gentlemen," said the individual in black, "are you all agreed upon your verdict?" "We are," replied the foreman. "Do you find for the plaintiff, gentlemen, or for the defendant?" "For the plaintiff." "With what damages, gentlemen?" £750. Mr. Pickwick took off his spectacles, carefully wiped the glasses, folded them into their case, and put them in his pocket. Then, having drawn on his gloves with great nicety, and stared at the foreman all the while, he mechanically followed Mr. Perker and the blue bag out of court. They stopped in a side room while Perker paid the court fees, and here Mr. Pickwick was joined by his friends. Here, too, he encountered Messrs. Dodson and Fogg, rubbing their hands with every token of outward satisfaction. "Well, gentlemen," said Mr. Pickwick. "Well, sir," said Dodson, for self and partner. "You imagine you'll get your costs, don't you, gentlemen?" said Mr. Pickwick. Fogg said they thought it rather probable. Dodson smiled and said they'd try. "You may try, and try, and try again, Messrs. Dodson and Fogg," said Mr. Pickwick vehemently, "but not one farthing of costs or damages do you ever get from me if I spend the rest of my existence in a debtor's prison." "Ha, ha!" laughed Dodson. "You'll think better of that before next term, Mr. Pickwick." "We'll soon see about that, Mr. Pickwick," grinned Fogg. Speechless with indignation, Mr. Pickwick allowed himself to be led by his solicitor and friends to the door, and there assisted into a hackney coach which had been fetched for the purpose by the ever watchful Sam Weller. Sam had put up the steps and was preparing to jump upon the box, when he felt himself gently touched on the shoulder, and looking round, his father stood before him. The old gentleman's countenance wore a mournful expression as he shook his head gravely and said, in warning accents, "I knowed what 'ud come o' this here mode o' doing business. Oh, Sammy, Sammy, vy warn't there a alibi?" End of chapter 34.
Chapter 35 of the Pickwick Papers by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Debra, Lynn. The Pickwick Papers by Charles Dickens. Chapter 35, in which Mr. Pickwick thinks he had better go to Bath, and goes accordingly. "But surely, my dear sir," said little Perker, as he stood in Mr. Pickwick's apartment on the morning after the trial, "surely you don't really mean, really and seriously now, and irritation apart, that you won't pay these costs and damages?" "Not one halfpenny," said Mr. Pickwick firmly. "Not one halfpenny." "Hurrah for the principal, as the moneylender said ven he wouldn't renew the bill," observed Mr. Weller, who was clearing away the breakfast things. "Sam," said Mr. Pickwick, "have the goodness to step downstairs." "Certainly, sir," replied Mr. Weller, and acting on Mr. Pickwick's gentle hint, Sam retired. "No, Perker," said Mr. Pickwick, with great seriousness of manner. "My friends here have endeavoured to dissuade me from this determination, but without avail. I shall employ myself as usual until the opposite party have the power of issuing a legal process of execution against me, and if they are vile enough to avail themselves of it, and to arrest my person, I shall yield myself up with perfect cheerfulness and content of heart. When can they do this?" "They can issue execution, my dear sir, for the amount of the damages and taxed costs, next term," replied Perker. "Just 2 months hence, my dear sir." "Very good," said Mr. Pickwick. "Until that time, my dear fellow, let me hear no more of the matter. And now," continued Mr. Pickwick, looking round on his friends with a good humored smile and a sparkle in his eye which no spectacles could dim or conceal, "the only question is, where shall we go next?" Mr. Tupman and Mr. Snodgrass were too much affected by their friend's heroism to offer any reply. Mr. Winkle had not yet sufficiently recovered the recollection of his evidence at the trial to make any observation on any subject, so Mr. Pickwick paused in vain. "Well," said that gentleman, "if you leave me to suggest our destination, I say Bath. I think none of us have ever been there." Nobody had, and as the proposition was warmly seconded by Perker, who considered it extremely probable that if Mr. Pickwick saw a little change in gaiety he would be inclined to think better of his determination, and worse of a debtor's prison, it was carried unanimously, and Sam was at once dispatched to the White Horse Cellar to take 5 places by the 7:30 coach next morning. There were just 2 places to be had inside, and just 3 to be had out, so Sam Weller booked for them all, and having exchanged a few compliments with the booking office clerk on the subject of a pewter half-crown which was tendered him as a portion of his change, walked back to the George and Vulture, where he was pretty busily employed until bedtime in reducing clothes and linen into the smallest possible compass, and exerting his mechanical genius in constructing a variety of ingenious devices for keeping the lids on boxes which had neither locks nor hinges. The next was a very unpropitious morning for a journey, muggy, damp, and drizzly. The horses in the stages that were going out and had come through the city were smoking so that the outside passengers were invisible. The newspaper sellers looked moist and smelled mouldy. The wet ran off the hats of the orange vendors as they thrust their heads into the coach windows, and diluted the insides in a refreshing manner. The Jews with the 50-bladed penknives shut them up in despair. The men with the pocketbooks made pocketbooks of them. Watch guards and toasting forks were alike at a discount, and pencil cases and sponges were a drug in the market. Leaving Sam Weller to rescue the luggage from the 7 or 8 porters who flung themselves savagely upon it the moment the coach stopped, and finding that they were about 20 minutes too early, Mr. Pickwick and his friends went for shelter into the traveller's room, the last resource of human dejection. The traveller's room at the White Horse Cellar is, of course, uncomfortable. It would be no traveller's room if it were not. It is the right-hand parlor, into which an aspiring kitchen fireplace appears to have walked, accompanied by a rebellious poker, tongs, and shovel. It is divided into boxes for the solitary confinement of travellers, and is furnished with a clock, a looking-glass, and a live waiter, which latter article is kept in a small kennel for washing glasses in a corner of the apartment. One of these boxes was occupied on this particular occasion by a stern-eyed man of about 45, who had a bald and glossy forehead, with a good deal of black hair at the sides and back of his head, and large black whiskers. He was buttoned up to the chin in a brown coat, and had a large sealskin travelling cap and a greatcoat and cloak lying on the seat beside him. He looked up from his breakfast as Mr. Pickwick entered, with a fierce and peremptory air, which was very dignified, and having scrutinized that gentleman and his companions to his entire satisfaction, hummed a tune in a manner which seemed to say that he rather suspected somebody wanted to take advantage of him, but it wouldn't do. "Waiter!" said the gentleman with the whiskers. "Sir," replied a man with a dirty complexion and a towel of the same, emerging from the kennel before mentioned. "Some more toast." "Yes, sir." "Buttered toast, mind," said the gentleman fiercely. "Directly, sir," replied the waiter. The gentleman with the whiskers hummed a tune in the same manner as before, and pending the arrival of the toast, advanced to the front of the fire, and taking his coat tails under his arms, looked at his boots and ruminated. "I wonder whereabouts in Bath this coach puts up," said Mr. Pickwick, mildly addressing Mr. Winkle. What's that?" said the strange man. "I made an observation to my friend, sir," replied Mr. Pickwick, always ready to enter into conversation. "I wondered at what house the Bath coach put up. Perhaps you can inform me." "Are you going to Bath?" said the strange man. "I am, sir," replied Mr. Pickwick. "And those other gentlemen?" "They are going also," said Mr. Pickwick. "Not inside. I'll be damned if you're going inside," said the strange man. "Not all of us," said Mr. Pickwick. "No, not all of you," said the strange man, emphatically. "I've taken 2 places. If they try to squeeze 6 people into an infernal box that only holds 4, I'll take a post chaise and bring an action. I've paid my fare. It won't do. I told the clerk when I took my places that it wouldn't do. I know these things have been done. I know they are done every day, but I never was done, and I never will be. Those who know me best know it. Crush me!" Here the fierce gentleman rang the bell with great violence, and told the waiter he'd better bring the toast in 5 seconds, or he'd know the reason why. "My good sir," said Mr. Pickwick, "you will allow me to observe that this is a very unnecessary display of excitement. I have only taken places inside for 2." "I am glad to hear it," said the fierce man. "I withdraw my expressions. I tender an apology. There's my card. Give me your acquaintance." "With great pleasure, sir," replied Mr. Pickwick. "We are to be fellow travelers, and I hope we shall find each other's society mutually agreeable." "I hope we shall," said the fierce gentleman. "I know we shall. I like your looks. They please me. Gentlemen, your hands and names know me." Of course, an interchange of friendly salutations followed this gracious speech, and the fierce gentleman immediately proceeded to inform the friends, in the same short, abrupt, jerking sentences, that his name was Dowler, that he was going to Bath on pleasure, that he was formerly in the army, that he had now set up in business as a gentleman, that he lived upon the profits, and that the individual for whom the second place was taken was a personage no less illustrious than Mrs. Dowler, his lady wife. "She's a fine woman," said Mr. Dowler. "I am proud of her. I have reason." "I hope I shall have the pleasure of judging," said Mr. Pickwick, with a smile. "You shall," replied Dowler. "She shall know you. She shall esteem you. I courted her under singular circumstances. I won her through a rash vow. Thus: I saw her, I loved her, I proposed. She refused me. You love another? Spare my blushes. I know him. You do? Very good. If he remains here, I'll skin him." "Lord bless me!" exclaimed Mr. Pickwick, involuntarily. "Did you skin the gentleman, sir?" inquired Mr. Winkle, with a very pale face. "I wrote him a note. I said it was a painful thing, and so it was." "Certainly," interposed Mr. Winkle. "I said I had pledged my word as a gentleman to skin him. My character was at stake. I had no alternative. As an officer in His Majesty's service I was bound to skin him. I regretted the necessity, but it must be done. He was open to conviction. He saw that the rules of the service were imperative. He fled. I married her. Here's the coach. That's her head." As Mr. Dowler concluded, he pointed to a stage which had just driven up, from the open window of which a rather pretty face in a bright blue bonnet was looking among the crowd on the pavement, most probably for the rash man himself. Mr. Dowler paid his bill and hurried out with his traveling cap, coat, and cloak, and Mr. Pickwick and his friends followed to secure their places. Mr. Tupman and Mr. Snodgrass had seated themselves at the back part of the coach. Mr. Winkle had got inside, and Mr. Pickwick was preparing to follow him, when Sam Weller came up to his master, and whispering in his ear, begged to speak to him with an air of the deepest mystery. "Well, Sam," said Mr. Pickwick, "what's the matter now?" "Here's rayther a rum go, sir," replied Sam. "What?" inquired Mr. Pickwick. "This here, sir," rejoined Sam. "I'm wery much afeard, sir, that the properiator of this here coach is a playing some imprints vith us." "How is that, Sam?" said Mr. Pickwick. "Aren't the names down on the way-bill?" "The names is not only down on the vay-bill, sir," replied Sam, "but they've painted vun on 'em up on the door of the coach." As Sam spoke, he pointed to that part of the coach door on which the proprietor's name usually appears, and there, sure enough, in gilt letters of a goodly size, was the magic name of Pickwick. "Dear me!" exclaimed Mr. Pickwick, quite staggered by the coincidence. "What a very extraordinary thing!" "Yes, but that ain't all," said Sam, again directing his master's attention to the coach door. "Not content with writing up Pickwick, they puts Moses afore it, which I call adding insult to injury, as the parrot said, ven they not only took him from his native land, but made him talk the English language arterwards." "It's odd enough, certainly, Sam," said Mr. Pickwick, "but if we stand talking here we shall lose our places." "What! Ain't nothin' to be done in consequence, sir?" exclaimed Sam, perfectly aghast at the coolness with which Mr. Pickwick prepared to ensconce himself inside. "Done?" said Mr. Pickwick. "What should be done?" "Ain't nobody to be whopped for taking this here liberty, sir?" said Mr. Weller, who had expected that at least he would have been commissioned to challenge the guard and the coachman to a pugilistic encounter on the spot. "Certainly not," replied Mr. Pickwick eagerly. "Not on any account. Jump up to your seat directly." "I am werry much afeard," muttered Sam to himself, as he turned away, "that something queer's come over the governor, or he'd never ha' stood this so quiet. I hope that 'ere trial hasn't broke his spirit, but it looks bad, werry bad." Mr. Weller shook his head gravely, and it is worthy of remark, as an illustration of the manner in which he took this circumstance to heart, that he did not speak another word until the coach reached the Kensington turnpike, which was so long a time for him to remain taciturn that the fact may be considered wholly unprecedented. Nothing worthy of special mention occurred during the journey. Mr. Dowler related a variety of anecdotes, all illustrative of his own personal prowess and desperation, and appealed to Mrs. Dowler in corroboration thereof, when Mrs. Dowler invariably brought in the form of an appendix, some remarkable fact or circumstance which Mr. Dowler had forgotten, or had perhaps through modesty omitted, for the addenda in every instance went to show that Mr. Dowler was even a more wonderful fellow than he made himself out to be. Mr. Pickwick and Mr. Winkle listened with great admiration, and at intervals conversed with Mrs. Dowler, who was a very agreeable and fascinating person. So what between Mr. Dowler's stories, and Mrs. Dowler's charms, and Mr. Pickwick's good humor, and Mr. Winkle's good listening, the insides contrived to be very companionable all the way. The outsides did as outsides always do. They were very cheerful and talkative at the beginning of every stage, and very dismal and sleepy in the middle, and very bright and wakeful again towards the end. There was one young gentleman in an India rubber cloak who smoked cigars all day, and there was another young gentleman in a parody upon a greatcoat who lighted a good many, and feeling obviously unsettled after the second whiff, threw them away when he thought nobody was looking at him. There was a third young man on the box who wished to be learned in cattle, and an old one behind who was familiar with farming. There was a constant succession of Christian names in smock frocks and white coats who were invited to have a lift by the guard, and who knew every horse and hostler on the road and off it. And there was a dinner which would have been cheap at half a crown a mouth, if any moderate number of mouths could have eaten it in the time. And at 7 o'clock p.m. Mr. Pickwick and his friends, and Mr. Dowler and his wife, respectively retired to their private sitting rooms at the White Hart Hotel, opposite the great pump room, Bath, where the waiters, from their costume, might be mistaken for Westminster boys, only they destroyed the illusion by behaving themselves much better. Breakfast had scarcely been cleared away on the succeeding morning when a waiter brought in Mr. Dowler's card with a request to be allowed permission to introduce a friend. Mr. Dowler at once followed up the delivery of the card by bringing himself and the friend also. The friend was a charming young man of not much more than 50, dressed in a very bright blue coat with resplendent buttons, black trousers, and the thinnest possible pair of highly polished boots. A gold eyeglass was suspended from his neck by a short, broad, black ribbon. A gold snuff-box was lightly clasped in his left hand, gold rings innumerable glittered on his fingers, and a large diamond pin set in gold glistened in his shirt frill. He had a gold watch and a gold curb chain with large gold seals, and he carried a pliant ebony cane with a gold top. His linen was of the very whitest, finest, and stiffest, his wig of the glossiest, blackest, and curliest. His snuff was Prince's mixture, his scent Bouquet de Roi. His features were contracted into a perpetual smile, and his teeth were in such perfect order that it was difficult at a small distance to tell the real from the false. "Mr. Pickwick," said Mr. Dowler, "my friend Angelo Cyrus Bantam, Esquire, M.C. Bantam, Mr. Pickwick. Know each other." "Welcome to Bath, sir. This is indeed an acquisition. Most welcome to Bath, sir. It is long, very long, Mr. Pickwick, since you drank the waters. It appears an age, Mr. Pickwick. Remarkable." Such were the expressions with which Angelo Cyrus Bantam, Esquire, M.C., took Mr. Pickwick's hand, retaining it in his, meantime, and shrugging up his shoulders with a constant succession of bows, as if he really could not make up his mind to the trial of letting it go again. "It is a very long time since I drank the waters, certainly," replied Mr. Pickwick, "for to the best of my knowledge I was never here before." "Never in Bath, Mr. Pickwick!" exclaimed the Grand Master, letting the hand fall in astonishment. "Never in Bath? Heh, heh! Mr. Pickwick, you are a wag. Not bad, not bad. Good, good. Heh, heh, heh! Remarkable!" "To my shame I must say that I am perfectly serious," rejoined Mr. Pickwick. "I really never was here before." "Oh, I see!" exclaimed the Grand Master, looking extremely pleased. "Yes, yes! Good, good! Better and better! You are the gentleman of whom we have heard. Yes, we know you, Mr. Pickwick, we know you." "The reports of the trial in those confounded papers," thought Mr. Pickwick. "They have heard all about me." "You are the gentleman residing on Clapham Green," resumed Bantam, "who lost the use of his limbs from imprudently taking cold after port wine, who could not be moved in consequence of acute suffering, and who had the water from the King's Bath bottled at 103° and sent by wagon to his bedroom in town, where he bathed, sneezed, and the same day recovered. Very remarkable." Mr. Pickwick acknowledged the compliment which the supposition implied, but had the self denial to repudiate it notwithstanding, and taking advantage of a moment's silence on the part of the M.C., begged to introduce his friends, Mr. Tupman, Mr. Winkle, and Mr. Snodgrass, an introduction which overwhelmed the M.C. with delight and honor. "Bantam," said Mr. Dowler, "Mr. Pickwick and his friends are strangers. They must put their names down. Where's the book?" "The register of the distinguished visitors in Bath will be at the pump room this morning at 2 o'clock," replied the M.C. "Will you guide our friends to that splendid building, and enable me to procure their autographs?" "I will," rejoined Dowler. "This is a long call. It's time to go. I shall be here again in an hour. Come." "This is a ball night," said the M.C., again taking Mr. Pickwick's hand as he rose to go. "The ball nights in Bath are moments snatched from paradise, rendered bewitching by music, beauty, elegance, fashion, etiquette, and above all, by the absence of tradespeople, who are quite inconsistent with paradise, and who have an amalgamation of themselves at the Guildhall every fortnight, which is, to say the least, remarkable. Good bye, good bye!" And protesting all the way downstairs that he was most satisfied, and most delighted, and most overpowered, and most flattered, Angelo Cyrus Bantam, Esquire, M.C., stepped into a very elegant chariot that waited at the door, and rattled off. At the appointed hour, Mr. Pickwick and his friends, escorted by Dowler, repaired to the assembly rooms, and wrote their names down in the book, an instance of condescension at which Angelo Bantam was even more overpowered than before. Tickets of admission to that evening's assembly were to have been prepared for the whole party, but as they were not ready, Mr. Pickwick undertook, despite all the protestations to the contrary of Angelo Bantam, to send Sam for them at 4 o'clock in the afternoon to the M.C.'s house in Queen Square. Having taken a short walk through the city, and arrived at the unanimous conclusion that Park Street was very much like the perpendicular streets a man sees in a dream, which he cannot get up for the life of him, they returned to the White Hart, and despatched Sam on the errand which his master had pledged him. Sam Weller put on his hat in a very easy and graceful manner, and thrusting his hands in his waistcoat pockets, walked with great deliberation to Queen Square, whistling as he went along several of the most popular airs of the day, as arranged with entirely new movements for that noble instrument the organ, either mouth or barrel. Arriving at the number in Queen Square to which he had been directed, he left off whistling and gave a cheerful knock, which was instantaneously answered by a powdered-headed footman in gorgeous livery and of symmetrical stature. "Is this here Mr. Bantam's, old feller?" inquired Sam Weller, nothing abashed by the blaze of splendor which burst upon his sight in the person of the powdered-headed footman with the gorgeous livery. "Why, young man?" was the haughty inquiry of the powdered-headed footman. "'Cause if it is, just you step in to him with that 'ere card, and say Mr. Veller's a-waitin', will you?" said Sam, and saying it, he very coolly walked into the hall and sat down. The powdered-headed footman slammed the door very hard, and scowled very grandly, but both the slam and the scowl were lost upon Sam, who was regarding a mahogany umbrella stand with every outward token of critical approval. Apparently his master's reception of the card had impressed the powdered-headed footman in Sam's favor, for when he came back from delivering it he smiled in a friendly manner, and said that the answer would be ready directly. "Wery good," said Sam. "Tell the old gentleman not to put himself in a perspiration. No hurry, 6 foot. I've had my dinner." "You dine early, sir," said the powdered-headed footman. "I find I gets on better at supper when I does," replied Sam. "Have you been long in Bath, sir?" inquired the powdered-headed footman. "I have not had the pleasure of hearing of you before." "I haven't created any wery surprisin' sensation here as yet," rejoined Sam, "for me and the other fashionables only come last night." "Nice place, sir," said the powdered-headed footman. "Seems so," observed Sam. "Pleasant society, sir," remarked the powdered-headed footman. "Very agreeable servants, sir." "I should think they was," replied Sam. "Affable, unaffected, say nothin' to nobody sorts of fellers." "Oh, very much so indeed, sir," said the powdered-headed footman, taking Sam's remarks as a high compliment. "Very much so indeed." "Do you do anything in this way, sir?" inquired the tall footman, producing a small snuff box with a fox's head on the top of it. "Not without sneezing," replied Sam. "Why, it is difficult, sir, I confess," said the tall footman. "It may be done by degrees, sir. Coffee is the best practice. I carried coffee, sir, for a long time. It looks very like rappee, sir." Here a sharp peal at the bell reduced the powdered-headed footman to the ignominious necessity of putting the fox's head in his pocket and hastening with a humble countenance to Mr. Bantam's study. By the by, who ever knew a man who never read or wrote either, who hadn't got some small back parlor which he would call a study? "There is the answer, sir," said the powdered-headed footman. "I'm afraid you'll find it inconveniently large." "Don't mention it," said Sam, taking a letter with a small enclosure. "It's just possible as exhausted nater may manage to surwive it." "I hope we shall meet again, sir," said the powdered-headed footman, rubbing his hands, and following Sam out to the doorstep. "You are wery obligin', sir," replied Sam. "Now don't allow yourself to be fatigued beyond your powers, there's a amiable bein'. Consider what you owe to society, and don't let yourself be injured by too much work. For the sake of your fellow creeters, keep yourself as quiet as you can. Only think what a loss you would be." With these pathetic words Sam Weller departed. "Very singular young man, that," said the powdered-headed footman, looking after Mr. Weller, with a countenance which clearly showed he could make nothing of him. Sam said nothing at all. He winked, shook his head, smiled, winked again, and with an expression of countenance which seemed to denote that he was greatly amused with something or other, walked merrily away. At precisely 20 minutes before 8 o'clock that night, Angelo Cyrus Bantam, Esquire, the master of the ceremonies, emerged from his chariot at the door of the assembly rooms in the same wig, the same teeth, the same eyeglass, the same watch and seals, the same rings, the same shirt pin, and the same cane. The only observable alterations in his appearance were that he wore a brighter blue coat with a white silk lining, black tights, black silk stockings and pumps, and a white waistcoat, and was, if possible, just a thought more scented. Thus attired, the master of the ceremonies, in strict discharge of the important duties of his all-important office, planted himself in the room to receive the company. Bath being full, the company and the sixpences for tea poured in shoals. In the ball-room, the long card-room, the octagonal card-room, the staircases and the passages, the hum of many voices and the sound of many feet were perfectly bewildering. Dresses rustled, feathers waved, lights shone, and jewels sparkled. There was the music, not of the quadrille band, for it had not yet commenced, but the music of soft, tiny footsteps, with now and then a clear, merry laugh, low and gentle, but very pleasant to hear in a female voice, whether in Bath or elsewhere. Brilliant eyes, lighted up with pleasurable expectation, gleamed from every side, and look where you would, some exquisite form glided gracefully through the throng, and was no sooner lost than it was replaced by another as dainty and bewitching. In the tea-room, and hovering round the card-tables, were a vast number of queer old ladies and decrepit old gentlemen, discussing all the small talk and scandal of the day, with a relish and gusto which sufficiently bespoke the intensity of the pleasure they derived from the occupation. Mingled with these groups were 3 or 4 match-making mammas, appearing to be wholly absorbed by the conversation in which they were taking part, but failing not, from time to time, to cast an anxious sidelong glance upon their daughters, who, remembering the maternal injunction to make the best use of their youth, had already commenced incipient flirtations in the mislaying scarves, putting on gloves, setting down cups, and so forth. Slight matters, apparently, but which may be turned to surprisingly good account by expert practitioners. Lounging near the doors, and in remote corners, were various knots of silly young men displaying various varieties of puppyism and stupidity, amusing all sensible people near them with their folly and conceit, and happily thinking themselves the objects of general admiration, a wise and merciful dispensation which no good man will quarrel with. And lastly, seated on some of the back benches, where they had already taken up their positions for the evening, were divers unmarried ladies past their grand climacteric, who, not dancing because there were no partners for them, and not playing cards lest they should be set down as irretrievably single, were in the favourable situation of being able to abuse everybody without reflecting on themselves. In short, they could abuse everybody because everybody was there. It was a scene of gaiety, glitter and show, of richly dressed people, handsome mirrors, chalked floors, girandolas, and wax candles, and in all parts of the scene, gliding from spot to spot in silent softness, bowing obsequiously to this party, nodding familiarly to that, and smiling complacently on all, was the sprucely attired person of Angelo Cyrus Bantam, Esquire, the master of the ceremonies. "Stop in the tea room. Take your sixpennorth. Then lay on hot water and call it tea. Drink it," said Mr. Dowler in a loud voice, directing Mr. Pickwick, who advanced at the head of the little party with Mrs. Dowler on his arm. Into the tea room Mr. Pickwick turned, and catching sight of him, Mr. Bantam corkscrewed his way through the crowd and welcomed him with ecstasy. "My dear sir, I am highly honored. Bath is favored. Mrs. Dowler, you embellish the rooms. I congratulate you on your feathers. Remarkable." "Anybody here?" inquired Dowler suspiciously. "Anybody. The elite of Bath. Mr. Pickwick, do you see the old lady in the gauze turban?" "The fat old lady?" inquired Mr. Pickwick innocently. "Hush, my dear sir, nobody's fat or old in Bath. That's the Dowager Lady Snuffanuff." "Is it indeed?" said Mr. Pickwick. "No less a person, I assure you," said the master of the ceremonies. "Hush, draw a little nearer, Mr. Pickwick. You see the splendidly dressed young man coming this way?" "The one with the long hair and the particularly small forehead?" inquired Mr. Pickwick. "The same. The richest young man in Bath at this moment. Young Lord Muttonhead." "You don't say so!" said Mr. Pickwick. "Yes. You'll hear his voice in a moment, Mr. Pickwick. He'll speak to me. The other gentleman with him, in the red under waistcoat and dark moustache, is the Honourable Mr. Crushton, his bosom friend. How do you do, my lord?" "Very hot, Bantam," said his lordship. "It is very warm, my lord," replied the M.C. "Confounded," assented the Honourable Mr. Crushton. "Have you seen his lordship's mail cart, Bantam?" inquired the Honourable Mr. Crushton after a short pause, during which young Lord Muttonhead had been endeavouring to stare Mr. Pickwick out of countenance, and Mr. Crushton had been reflecting what subject his lordship could talk about best. "Dear me, no," replied the M.C. "A mail cart? What an excellent idea! Remarkable!" "Gracious heavens!" said his lordship. "I thought everybody had seen the new mail cart. It's the neatest, puttiest, wastefullest thing that ever wan upon wheels. Painted wed, with a queen piebald." "With a real box for the letters, and all complete," said the Honourable Mr. Crushton. "And a little seat in front, with an iron whale for the dwiver," added his lordship. "I dwove it over to Bristol the other morning in a crimson coat, with two servants waiting a quarter of a mile behind, and confound me if the people didn't wush out of their cottages and west my progress to know if I wasn't the post. Glorious, glorious!" At this anecdote his lordship laughed very heartily, as did the listeners, of course. Then, drawing his arm through that of the obsequious Mr. Crushton, Lord Muttonhead walked away. "Delightful young man, his lordship," said the master of the ceremonies. "So I should think," rejoined Mr. Pickwick dryly. The dancing having commenced, the necessary introductions having been made, and all preliminaries arranged, Angelo Bantam rejoined Mr. Pickwick and led him into the card room. Just at the very moment of their entrance, the Dowager Lady Snuffanuff and two other ladies of an ancient and whist-like appearance were hovering over an unoccupied card table, and they no sooner set eyes upon Mr. Pickwick under the convoy of Angelo Bantam than they exchanged glances with each other, seeing that he was precisely the very person they wanted to make up the rubber. "My dear Bantam," said the Dowager Lady Snuffanuff coaxingly, "find us some nice creature to make up this table, there's a good soul." Mr. Pickwick happened to be looking another way at the moment, so her ladyship nodded her head towards him and frowned expressively. "My friend Mr. Pickwick, my lady, will be most happy, I am sure, remarkably so," said the M.C., taking the hint. "Mr. Pickwick, Lady Snuffanuff, Mrs. Colonel Wugsby, Miss Bolo." Mr. Pickwick bowed to each of the ladies, and finding escape impossible, cut. Mr. Pickwick and Miss Bolo against Lady Snuffanuff and Mrs. Colonel Wugsby. As the trump card was turned up at the commencement of the second deal, two young ladies hurried into the room, and took their stations on either side of Mrs. Colonel Wugsby's chair, where they waited patiently until the hand was over. "Now, Jane," said Mrs. Colonel Wugsby, turning to one of the girls, "what is it?" "I came to ask, Ma, whether I might dance with the youngest Mr. Crawley," whispered the prettier and younger of the two. "Good God, Jane, how can you think of such things?" replied the mamma indignantly. "Haven't you repeatedly heard that his father has 800 a year, which dies with him? I am ashamed of you, not on any account." "Ma," whispered the other, who was much older than her sister, and very insipid and artificial, "Lord Muttonhead has been introduced to me. I said I thought I wasn't engaged, Ma." "You're a sweet pet, my love," replied Mrs. Colonel Wugsby, tapping her daughter's cheek with her fan, "and are always to be trusted. He's immensely rich, my dear, bless you." With these words Mrs. Colonel Wugsby kissed her eldest daughter most affectionately, and frowning in a warning manner upon the other, sorted her cards. Poor Mr. Pickwick! He had never played with three thorough-paced female card players before. They were so desperately sharp that they quite frightened him. If he played a wrong card, Miss Bolo looked a small armory of daggers. If he stopped to consider which was the right one, Lady Snuffanuff would throw herself back in her chair and smile with a mingled glance of impatience and pity to Mrs. Colonel Wugsby, at which Mrs. Colonel Wugsby would shrug up her shoulders and cough, as much as to say she wondered whether he ever would begin. Then, at the end of every hand, Miss Bolo would inquire, with a dismal countenance and reproachful sigh, why Mr. Pickwick had not returned that diamond, or led the club, or ruffed the spade, or finessed the heart, or led through the honour, or brought out the ace, or played up to the king, or some such thing, and in reply to all these grave charges Mr. Pickwick would be wholly unable to plead any justification whatever, having by this time forgotten all about the game. People came and looked on, too, which made Mr. Pickwick nervous. Besides all this, there was a great deal of distracting conversation near the table between Angelo Bantam and the two Misses Matiner, who, being single and singular, paid great court to the master of the ceremonies, in the hope of getting a stray partner now and then. All these things, combined with the noises and interruptions of constant comings in and goings out, made Mr. Pickwick play rather badly. The cards were against him also, and when they left off, at 10 minutes past 11, Miss Bolo rose from the table, considerably agitated, and went straight home, in a flood of tears and a sedan chair. Being joined by his friends, who one and all protested that they had scarcely ever spent a more pleasant evening, Mr. Pickwick accompanied them to the White Hart, and having soothed his feelings with something hot, went to bed and to sleep almost simultaneously. End of chapter 35. Chapter 36 of the Pickwick Papers by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Debra Lynn. The Pickwick Papers by Charles Dickens. Chapter 36, the chief features of which will be found to be an authentic version of the legend of Prince Bladud, and a most extraordinary calamity that befell Mr. Winkle. As Mr. Pickwick contemplated a stay of at least 2 months in Bath, he deemed it advisable to take private lodgings for himself and friends for that period, and as a favourable opportunity offered for their securing, on moderate terms, the upper portion of a house in the Royal Crescent, which was larger than they required, Mr. and Mrs. Dowler offered to relieve them of a bedroom and sitting room. This proposition was at once accepted, and in 3 days' time they were all located in their new abode, when Mr. Pickwick began to drink the waters with the utmost assiduity. Mr. Pickwick took them systematically. He drank a quarter of a pint before breakfast, and then walked up a hill, and another quarter of a pint after breakfast, and then walked down a hill. And after every fresh quarter of a pint, Mr. Pickwick declared in the most solemn and emphatic terms that he felt a great deal better, whereat his friends were very much delighted, though they had not been previously aware that there was anything the matter with him. The great pump room is a spacious saloon ornamented with Corinthian pillars and a music gallery, and a Tompion clock, and a statue of Nash, and a golden inscription, to which all the water drinkers should attend, for it appeals to them in the cause of a deserving charity.
There is a large bar with a marble vase, out of which the pumper gets the water, and there are a number of yellow-looking tumblers, out of which the company get it, and it is a most edifying and satisfactory sight to behold the perseverance and gravity with which they swallow it. There are baths near at hand, in which a part of the company wash themselves, and a band plays afterwards, to congratulate the remainder on their having done so. There is another pump room, into which infirm ladies and gentlemen are wheeled, in such an astonishing variety of chairs and chaises, that any adventurous individual who goes in with the regular number of toes is in imminent danger of coming out without them. And there is a third, into which the quiet people go, for it is less noisy than either. There is an immensity of promenading on crutches and off, with sticks and without, and a great deal of conversation and liveliness and pleasantry. Every morning the regular water drinkers, Mr. Pickwick among the number, met each other in the pump room, took their quarter of a pint, and walked constitutionally. At the afternoon's promenade, Lord Muttonhead and the Honourable Mr. Crushton, the Dowager Lady Snuffanuff, Mrs. Colonel Wugsby, and all the great people, and all the morning water drinkers, met in grand assemblage. After this they walked out, or drove out, or were pushed out in bath chairs, and met one another again. After this the gentlemen went to the reading rooms, and met divisions of the mass. After this they went home. If it were theatre night, perhaps they met at the theatre. If it were assembly night, they met at the rooms, and if it were neither, they met the next day. A very pleasant routine, with perhaps a slight tinge of sameness. Mr. Pickwick was sitting up by himself, after a day spent in this manner, making entries in his journal, his friends having retired to bed, when he was roused by a gentle tap at the room door. "Beg your pardon, sir," said Mrs. Craddock, the landlady, peeping in, "but did you want anything more, sir?" "Nothing more, ma'am," replied Mr. Pickwick. "My young girl is gone to bed, sir," said Mrs. Craddock, "and Mr. Dowler is good enough to say that he'll sit up for Mrs. Dowler, as the party isn't expected to be over till late. So I was thinking that if you wanted nothing more, Mr. Pickwick, I would go to bed." "By all means, ma'am," replied Mr. Pickwick. "Wish you good night, sir," said Mrs. Craddock. "Good night, ma'am," rejoined Mr. Pickwick. Mrs. Craddock closed the door, and Mr. Pickwick resumed his writing. In half an hour's time the entries were concluded. Mr. Pickwick carefully rubbed the last page on the blotting paper, shut up the book, wiped his pen on the bottom of the inside of his coat tail, and opened the drawer of the inkstand to put it carefully away. There were a couple of sheets of writing paper, pretty closely written over, in the inkstand drawer, and they were folded so that the title, which was in a good round hand, was fully disclosed to him. Seeing from this that it was no private document, and as it seemed to relate to Bath and was very short, Mr. Pickwick unfolded it, lighted his bedroom candle that it might burn up well by the time he finished, and drawing his chair nearer the fire, read as follows: "The true legend of Prince Bladud. Less than 200 years ago, on one of the public baths in this city, there appeared an inscription in honour of its mighty founder, the renowned Prince Bladud. That inscription is now erased. For many hundred years before that time, there had been handed down from age to age an old legend, that the illustrious prince, being afflicted with leprosy, on his return from reaping a rich harvest of knowledge in Athens, shunned the court of his royal father, and consorted moodily with husbandmen and pigs. Among the herd, so said the legend, was a pig of grave and solemn countenance, with whom the prince had a fellow feeling, for he too was wise, a pig of thoughtful and reserved demeanour, an animal superior to his fellows, whose grunt was terrible and whose bite was sharp. The young prince sighed deeply as he looked upon the countenance of the majestic swine. He thought of his royal father, and his eyes were bedewed with tears. This sagacious pig was fond of bathing in rich moist mud, not in summer as common pigs do now, to cool themselves, and did even in those distant ages, which is a proof that the light of civilization had already begun to dawn, though feebly, but in the cold sharp days of winter. His coat was ever so sleek, and his complexion so clear, that the prince resolved to essay the purifying qualities of the same water that his friend resorted to. He made the trial. Beneath that black mud bubbled the hot springs of Bath. He washed and was cured. Hastening to his father's court, he paid his best respects, and returning quickly hither, founded this city and its famous baths. He sought the pig with all the ardour of their early friendship, but, alas, the waters had been his death. He had imprudently taken a bath at too high a temperature, and the natural philosopher was no more. He was succeeded by Pliny, who also fell a victim to his thirst for knowledge. This was the legend. Listen to the true one. A great many centuries since, there flourished in great state the famous and renowned Lud Hudibras, King of Britain. He was a mighty monarch. The earth shook when he walked, he was so very stout. His people basked in the light of his countenance, it was so red and glowing. He was indeed every inch a king, and there were a good many inches of him too, for although he was not very tall, he was a remarkable size round, and the inches that he wanted in height he made up in circumference. If any degenerate monarch of modern times could be in any way compared with him, I should say the venerable King Cole would be that illustrious potentate. This good king had a queen, who 18 years before had had a son who was called Bladud. He was sent to a preparatory seminary in his father's dominions until he was 10 years old, and was then dispatched, in charge of a trusty messenger, to a finishing school at Athens. And as there was no extra charge for remaining during the holidays, and no notice required previous to the removal of a pupil, there he remained for 8 long years, at the expiration of which time the king his father sent the Lord Chamberlain over to settle the bill, and to bring him home, which the Lord Chamberlain doing, was received with shouts and pensioned immediately. When King Lud saw the prince his son, and found he had grown up such a fine young man, he perceived what a grand thing it would be to have him married without delay, so that his children might be the means of perpetuating the glorious race of Lud, down to the very latest ages of the world. With this view he sent a special embassy, composed of great noblemen who had nothing particular to do, and wanted lucrative employment, to a neighbouring king, and demanded his fair daughter in marriage for his son, stating at the same time that he was anxious to be on the most affectionate terms with his brother and friend, but that if they couldn't agree in arranging this marriage, he should be under the unpleasant necessity of invading his kingdom and putting his eyes out. To this the other king, who was the weaker of the two, replied that he was very much obliged to his friend and brother for all his goodness and magnanimity, and that his daughter was quite ready to be married whenever Prince Bladud liked to come and fetch her. This answer no sooner reached Britain than the whole nation was transported with joy. Nothing was heard on all sides but the sounds of feasting and revelry, except the chinking of money, as it was paid in by the people to the collector of the royal treasures, to defray the expenses of the happy ceremony. It was upon this occasion that King Lud, seated on the top of his throne in full council, rose in the exuberance of his feelings, and commanded the Lord Chief Justice to order in the richest wines and the court minstrels, an act of graciousness which has been, through the ignorance of traditionary historians, attributed to King Cole, in those celebrated lines in which his Majesty is represented as calling for his pipe, and calling for his pot, and calling for his fiddlers 3, which is an obvious injustice to the memory of King Lud, and a dishonest exaltation of the virtues of King Cole. But in the midst of all this festivity and rejoicing, there was one individual present who tasted not when the sparkling wines were poured forth, and who danced not when the minstrels played. This was no other than Prince Bladud himself, in honour of whose happiness a whole people were at that very moment straining alike their throats and purse strings. The truth was that the prince, forgetting the undoubted right of the Minister for Foreign Affairs to fall in love on his behalf, had, contrary to every precedent of policy and diplomacy, already fallen in love on his own account, and privately contracted himself unto the fair daughter of a noble Athenian. Here we have a striking example of one of the manifold advantages of civilization and refinement. If the prince had lived in later days, he might at once have married the object of his father's choice, and then set himself seriously to work to relieve himself of the burden which rested heavily upon him. He might have endeavoured to break her heart by a systematic course of insult and neglect, or, if the spirit of her sex and a proud consciousness of her many wrongs had upheld her under this ill treatment, he might have sought to take her life, and so get rid of her effectually. But neither mode of relief suggested itself to Prince Bladud, so he solicited a private audience and told his father. It is an old prerogative of kings to govern everything but their passions. King Lud flew into a frightful rage, tossed his crown up to the ceiling and caught it again, for in those days kings kept their crowns on their heads and not in the tower, stamped the ground, rapped his forehead, wondered why his own flesh and blood rebelled against him, and finally, calling in his guards, ordered the prince away to instant confinement in a lofty turret, a course of treatment which the kings of old very generally pursued towards their sons, when their matrimonial inclinations did not happen to point to the same quarter as their own. When Prince Bladud had been shut up in the lofty turret for the greater part of a year, with no better prospect before his bodily eyes than a stone wall, or before his mental vision than prolonged imprisonment, he naturally began to ruminate on a plan of escape, which, after months of preparation, he managed to accomplish, considerately leaving his dinner knife in the heart of his jailer, lest the poor fellow, who had a family, should be considered privy to his flight, and punished accordingly by the infuriated king. The monarch was frantic at the loss of his son. He knew not on whom to vent his grief and wrath, until, fortunately bethinking himself of the Lord Chamberlain who had brought him home, he struck off his pension and his head together. Meanwhile, the young prince, effectually disguised, wandered on foot through his father's dominions, cheered and supported in all his hardships by sweet thoughts of the Athenian maid who was the innocent cause of his weary trials. One day he stopped to rest in a country village, and seeing that there were gay dances going forward on the green, and gay faces passing to and fro, ventured to inquire of a reveller who stood near him the reason for this rejoicing. "Know you not, O stranger," was the reply, "of the recent proclamation of our gracious king?" "Proclamation? No, what proclamation?" rejoined the prince, for he had travelled along the by and little frequented ways, and knew nothing of what had passed upon the public roads, such as they were. "Why," replied the peasant, "the foreign lady that our prince wished to wed is married to a foreign noble of her own country, and the king proclaims the fact, and a great public festival besides. For now, of course, Prince Bladud will come back and marry the lady his father chose, who, they say, is as beautiful as the noonday sun. Your health, sir. God save the king." The prince remained to hear no more. He fled from the spot, and plunged into the thickest recesses of a neighbouring wood. On he wandered, night and day, beneath the blazing sun and the cold pale moon, through the dry heat of noon and the damp cold of night, in the grey light of morn and the red glare of eve. So heedless was he of time or object, that being bound for Athens, he wandered as far out of his way as Bath. There was no city where Bath stands then. There was no vestige of human habitation, or sign of man's resort, to bear the name. But there was the same noble country, the same broad expanse of hill and dale, the same beautiful channel stealing on, far away, the same lofty mountains, which, like the troubles of life, viewed at a distance, and partially obscured by the bright mist of its morning, lose their ruggedness and asperity, and seem all ease and softness. Moved by the gentle beauty of the scene, the prince sank upon the green turf, and bathed his swollen feet in his tears. "Oh," said the unhappy Bladud, clasping his hands and mournfully raising his eyes towards the sky, "would that my wanderings might end here! Would that these grateful tears with which I now mourn hope misplaced and love despised might flow in peace for ever!" The wish was heard. It was in the time of the heathen deities, who used occasionally to take people at their words with a promptness, in some cases, extremely awkward. The ground opened beneath the prince's feet. He sank into the chasm, and instantaneously it closed upon his head for ever, save where his hot tears welled up through the earth, and where they have continued to gush forth ever since. It is observable that, to this day, large numbers of elderly ladies and gentlemen who have been disappointed in procuring partners, and almost as many young ones who are anxious to obtain them, repair annually to Bath to drink the waters, from which they derive much strength and comfort. This is most complimentary to the virtue of Prince Bladud's tears, and strongly corroborative of the veracity of this legend. Mr. Pickwick yawned several times when he had arrived at the end of this little manuscript, carefully refolded and replaced it in the inkstand drawer, and then, with a countenance expressive of the utmost weariness, lighted his chamber candle, and went upstairs to bed. He stopped at Mr. Dowler's door, according to custom, and knocked to say good night. "Ah," said Dowler, "going to bed? I wish I was. Dismal night. Windy, isn't it?" "Very," said Mr. Pickwick. "Good night." "Good night." Mr. Pickwick went to his bedchamber, and Mr. Dowler resumed his seat before the fire, in fulfilment of his rash promise to sit up till his wife came home. There are few things more worrying than sitting up for somebody, especially if that somebody be at a party. You cannot help thinking how quickly the time passes with them, which drags so heavily with you, and the more you think of this, the more your hopes of their speedy arrival decline. Clocks tick so loud, too, when you are sitting up alone, and you seem as if you had an undergarment of cobwebs on. First something tickles your right knee, and then the same sensation irritates your left. You have no sooner changed your position than it comes again in the arms. When you have fidgeted your limbs into all sorts of queer shapes, you have a sudden relapse in the nose, which you rub as if to rub it off, as there is no doubt you would if you could. Eyes, too, are mere personal inconveniences, and the wick of one candle gets 1.5 inches long while you are snuffing the other. These and various other little nervous annoyances render sitting up for a length of time after everybody else has gone to bed anything but a cheerful amusement. This was just Mr. Dowler's opinion, as he sat before the fire, and felt honestly indignant with all the inhuman people at the party who were keeping him up. He was not put into better humour either by the reflection that he had taken it into his head early in the evening to think he had got an ache there, and so stopped at home. At length, after several droppings asleep, and fallings forward towards the bars, and catchings backward soon enough to prevent being branded in the face, Mr. Dowler made up his mind that he would throw himself on the bed in the back room and think, not sleep, of course. "I'm a heavy sleeper," said Mr. Dowler, as he flung himself on the bed. "I must keep awake. I suppose I shall hear a knock here. Yes, I thought so. I can hear the watchman. There he goes. Fainter now, though, a little fainter. He's turning the corner. Ah!" When Mr. Dowler arrived at this point, he turned the corner at which he had been long hesitating, and fell fast asleep. Just as the clock struck 3, there was blown into the crescent a sedan chair with Mrs. Dowler inside, borne by one short fat chairman and one long thin one, who had had much ado to keep their bodies perpendicular, to say nothing of the chair. But on that high ground, and in the crescent, which the wind swept round and round as if it were going to tear the paving stones up, its fury was tremendous. They were very glad to set the chair down, and give a good round, loud, double knock at the street door. They waited some time, but nobody came. "Servants is in the arms o' Porpoise, I think," said the short chairman, warming his hands at the attendant link boy's torch. "I wish he'd give 'em a squeeze and wake 'em," observed the long one. "Knock again, will you, if you please?" cried Mrs. Dowler from the chair. "Knock 2 or 3 times, if you please." The short man was quite willing to get the job over as soon as possible, so he stood on the step and gave 4 or 5 most startling double knocks, of 8 or 10 knocks apiece, while the long man went into the road and looked up at the windows for a light. Nobody came. It was all as silent and dark as ever. "Dear me," said Mrs. Dowler, "you must knock again, if you please." "There ain't a bell, is there, ma'am?" said the short chairman. "Yes, there is," interposed the link boy. "I've been a ringing at it ever so long." "It's only a handle," said Mrs. Dowler. "The wire's broken." "I wish the servants' heads was," growled the long man. "I must trouble you to knock again, if you please," said Mrs. Dowler with the utmost politeness. The short man did knock again several times, without producing the smallest effect. The tall man, growing very impatient, then relieved him, and kept on perpetually knocking, double knocks of 2 loud knocks each, like an insane postman. At length Mr. Winkle began to dream that he was at a club, and that the members being very refractory, the chairman was obliged to hammer the table a good deal to preserve order. Then he had a confused notion of an auction room where there were no bidders, and the auctioneer was buying everything in, and ultimately he began to think it just within the bounds of possibility that somebody might be knocking at the street door. To make quite certain, however, he remained quiet in bed for 10 minutes or so, and listened, and when he had counted 2 or 3 and 30 knocks, he felt quite satisfied, and gave himself a great deal of credit for being so wakeful. Rap, 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 ra 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 rap, went the knocker. Mr. Winkle jumped out of bed, wondering very much what could possibly be the matter, and hastily putting on his stockings and slippers, folded his dressing gown round him, lighted a flat candle from the rushlight that was burning in the fireplace, and hurried downstairs. "Here's somebody comin' at last, ma'am," said the short chairman. "I wish I was behind him with the bread all," muttered the long one. "Who's there?" cried Mr. Winkle, undoing the chain. "Don't stop to ask questions, cast iron head," replied the long man with great disgust, taking it for granted that the inquirer was a footman, "but open the door. Come, look sharp, timber eyelids," added the other encouragingly. Mr. Winkle, being half asleep, obeyed the command mechanically, opened the door a little, and peeped out. The first thing he saw was the red glare of the link boy's torch. Startled by the sudden fear that the house might be on fire, he hastily threw the door wide open, and holding the candle above his head, stared eagerly before him, not quite certain whether what he saw was a sedan chair or a fire engine. At this instant there came a violent gust of wind. The light was blown out. Mr. Winkle felt himself irresistibly impelled on to the steps, and the door blew to with a loud crash. "Well, young man, now you have done it," said the short chairman. Mr. Winkle, catching sight of a lady's face at the window of the sedan, turned hastily round, plied the knocker with all his might and main, and called frantically upon the chairman to take the chair away again. "Take it away, take it away," cried Mr. Winkle. "Here's somebody coming out of another house. Put me into the chair. Hide me. Do something with me." All this time he was shivering with cold, and every time he raised his hand to the knocker, the wind took the dressing gown in a most unpleasant manner. "The people are coming down the crescent now. There are ladies with them. Cover me up with something. Stand before me," roared Mr. Winkle. But the chairmen were too much exhausted with laughing to afford him the slightest assistance, and the ladies were every moment approaching nearer and nearer. Mr. Winkle gave a last hopeless knock. The ladies were only a few doors off. He threw away the extinguished candle, which all this time he had held above his head, and fairly bolted into the sedan chair where Mrs. Dowler was. Now Mrs. Craddock had heard the knocking and the voices at last, and only waiting to put something smarter on her head than her nightcap, ran down into the front drawing-room to make sure that it was the right party. Throwing up the window sash as Mr. Winkle was rushing into the chair, she no sooner caught sight of what was going forward below than she raised a vehement and dismal shriek, and implored Mr. Dowler to get up directly, for his wife was running away with another gentleman. Upon this Mr. Dowler bounced off the bed as abruptly as an india rubber ball, and rushing into the front room, arrived at one window just as Mr. Pickwick threw up the other, when the first object that met the gaze of both was Mr. Winkle bolting into the sedan chair. "Watchman!" shouted Dowler furiously. "Stop him! Hold him! Keep him tight! Shut him in till I come down! I'll cut his throat! Give me a knife, from ear to ear! Mrs. Craddock, I will!" And breaking from the shrieking landlady and from Mr. Pickwick, the indignant husband seized a small supper knife and tore into the street. But Mr. Winkle didn't wait for him. He no sooner heard the horrible threat of the valorous Dowler than he bounced out of the sedan quite as quickly as he had bounced in, and throwing off his slippers into the road, took to his heels and tore round the crescent, hotly pursued by Dowler and the watchman. He kept ahead. The door was open as he came round the second time. He rushed in, slammed it in Dowler's face, mounted to his bedroom, locked the door, piled a wash-hand stand, chest of drawers, and a table against it, and packed up a few necessaries, ready for flight with the first ray of morning. Dowler came up to the outside of the door, avowed through the keyhole his steadfast determination of cutting Mr. Winkle's throat next day, and after a great confusion of voices in the drawing-room, amidst which that of Mr. Pickwick was distinctly heard endeavouring to make peace, the inmates dispersed to their several bedchambers, and all was quiet once more. It is not unlikely that the inquiry may be made where Mr. Weller was all this time. We will state where he was in the next chapter. End of chapter 36.